Shalom and welcome everyone to the ICEJ webinar series. I'm David Parsons of the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, coming to you from our new TV studios here in our Jerusalem headquarters. We've got a good show this week in anticipation of the International Court of Justice issuing its advisory opinion on whether Israel has been in prolonged illegal occupation of what we call Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem, what the world calls the West Bank. There's going to be a ruling that will be issued on Friday this week about that. And so we're asking the question, will the World Court in The Hague divide the land of Israel? And here to help us look at this question and other legal issues swirling around Israel in The Hague is our friend Avi Bell. He is a legal scholar, law professor on international law, the laws of warfare, and the Israeli-Arab conflict. Avi, good to see you.
Great to see you too.
Okay, a little more on his background. He's a member of the Faculty of Law at Bar-Ilan University, also lectures at the University of San Diego Law School. You hold degrees from University of Chicago, Harvard University, and you previously taught at Fordham and the University of Connecticut.
That's right.
Quite a record here. And you're also a senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum, which was so involved in the judicial reform debate last year. Okay, Avi, we saw you in The Hague 2 weeks ago. You were there for the Israel Allies Foundation. They were holding a meeting. Then we held 3 days of meetings concerning this advisory opinion about to come out from the International Court of Justice, which we expect, we'll ask you what you expect, but what we were hearing, they're going to issue a tough opinion that Israel's an illegal occupier in land that it has a 4,000-year-old claim and connection to. But give us a little background to this request by the UN General Assembly for an advisory opinion. As we start out, it was UN General Assembly Resolution 77247 from December of 2 years ago. And these are the questions. Help us understand what they were asking. What are the legal consequences arising from the ongoing violation by Israel? I mean, it's built right into the question.
It's what lawyers call a question pregnant, where the answer is plain on the face of the question.
Yes, and violation by the right of Palestinian people to self-determination from its prolonged conflict. Maybe you want to break it down as you just look through it. What are some of the problems that it's already so slanted against Israel?
Well, let me just say a word before that, just about what the ICJ is, because I think it's important in order to be able to understand and translate questions like this.
Be very careful in your pronunciation. ICJ, not right. ICEJ.
Absolutely. It's very, and ICJ is inaptly named. I would say it's neither a court nor interested in justice, but that is its formal name, so that's what we'll be calling it. The ICJ is really an arbitration board that sits alongside the United Nations. Its judges are appointed by the General Assembly in a process that's international politics in the way that the General Assembly chooses other officials, so some reserved positions for permanent members of the Security Council and the rest by regional groups. And it means that the ICJ has a built-in interest, and long has had a built-in interest, in providing the General Assembly what it wants. So when the General Assembly asks for advisory opinions, it generally signals to the court exactly what answer it wants, and this is one where it's making sure that the ICJ understands what it's supposed to provide, and then the ICJ goes ahead and provides that. Now, sometimes it's too hot a potato, and the politics in the General Assembly are more divided, and so then the ICJ will try to dodge the question. You know, they'll give hair-splitting readings of the questions they don't have to give an answer. But this is not one of those cases. The politics of the General Assembly on Israel are very, very clear. The General Assembly is almost unanimously against Israel on any question. And so in this case, what we have is an opinion where it's trying to ask the ICJ to pronounce that Israel has no legal rights in Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem. When they say the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, they mean Judea, Samaria, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And they're trying to get the ICJ to say that and go beyond that and tell states that they're required to take certain anti-Israel actions to punish Israel for wrongly holding these territories. That's the question. Now, it's built in here, where if you read what the question says, it doesn't ask the court to say what the status is. It tells the court to tell us what the legal consequences of Israel doing this and that is wrong, and then to ask if there's something particularly wrong with the way Israel has governed in those territories where it governs in light of the passage of time since 1967. So we know what's going to come out of this, right? The ICJ is going to issue an opinion that says that Israel has not only no legal rights to this area, but that there are legal rights that belong exclusively to the Palestinian people, and that Israel's presence, they're going to call it an occupation, in any of these territories is unlawful, and therefore there should be a series of sanctions against Israel. Now, the only tricky thing for the court is how to handle the question of what the Palestinian rights are. Now, the reason it's tricky is that the ICJ was asked for an advisory opinion on Israel about 10 years ago. And that had to do with Israel's construction of a barrier.
The security barrier.
The security barrier that runs roughly between Judea and Samaria and Israel proper. But at the time, the ICJ decided that there was no Palestinian state. There still isn't, but the ICJ is a little bit in a trickier position now. There's no Palestinian state, and since there's no Palestinian state, they came up with a formula by which they decided that Israel has no right to defend itself or its citizens against Palestinian terrorism. One of the most remarkable, mind-blowing aspects of the prior ICJ opinion. Right? But they said because there's no state of Palestine and Israel is not being attacked by a state, but rather by terrorists, Israel has no right to defend its citizens or itself. Now, since then, the ICJ, it hasn't really made a formal decision, but it's accepted Palestine as a state. And the way it did so was in a different case. The PLO sued the United States for moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And the ICJ agreed to accept that case where the PLO called itself the State of Palestine. And so now the ICJ has a position that's different than its prior one, that there is a state of Palestine. Now, it's not a legally defensible position, but it's one that makes it difficult for the ICJ to continue maintaining its earlier position.
They painted themselves in a corner.
Exactly. They now have contradictory positions. And I don't think that they want to acknowledge that. And so they're going to have to do a little bit of a dance in which they are going to dodge the issue of exactly what the nature of the Palestinian rights are. But the bottom line is the bullseye is there, right? They know what the target is, to call Israeli actions illegal and describe all kinds of sanctions that have to be taken against Israel. And they're going to draw the argument around that. They're going to come up with whatever excuses and legal rhetoric they can to support that. And it's going to be a near unanimous decision. There is a reasonably good chance that the justice from Uganda will have a different view on this.
Julia Subatende.
Subatende, yeah.
Her own government's not happy with her, but she's a Christian who has a heart for Israel, and she expressed it in the genocide case brought by South Africa already.
And it's not only that, it's that because of that she's willing to be, I would say willing to be independent-minded and display a little judicial integrity, which you don't see very much.
But she was just voted an internal vote among the 15 justices to be the vice president of the court because they respect her for being independent-minded and not just a political hack in the court.
Right. There's more politics to it than I think to her appointment than respect for her integrity, because integrity, unfortunately, is not very highly valued in the ICJ. It's fairly clear, I think, that she will have a different view on this than the other justices. But the president of the court right now is a former diplomat from Lebanon who has expressed quite extreme views against Israel and more generally against Jewish people. And I think it's fairly clear what the General Assembly wants and therefore what the ICJ is going to do.
So if we can put those questions back up, you said that the International Court of Justice is supposed to be like an arbitration court. Normally, if two people are suing each other in some nation's courts, a judge might say, you need to go to mediation or arbitration, which is a separate body that you just accept rather than the whole formal trial. You accept someone coming up with a ruling. And here, the International Court of Justice, it's a court, what we call in the law, a court of first instance and last. There's no appeal above it, and it is the trial is held there, but it's not a normal trial with evidence and here's Exhibit A.
Right, this is not really a court in that sense at all. And I don't think it's a bad place to start thinking of it as an arbitration court. An arbitration court, as you said, is where parties agree and you have a ruling for this case only, for those parties only, within the bounds that they agree upon. And when the case is done, that's it. And the arbitrators don't take that case over to the next one. Now, the ICJ was actually born out of a prior court that was called the Permanent Court of Arbitration that sat alongside the League of Nations and was explicit that it was an arbitral court. This one, it doesn't say so in the name, but the primary jurisdiction of the court is to resolve disputes between states where both states have agreed to the jurisdiction of the court. And so if a state does not want to be there, if it hasn't agreed to jurisdiction, the court can't issue a ruling. The court can't do anything. And that is very much like arbitration and very unlike any court of law that we're familiar with. If you sue your neighbor for something in the United States in some civil case, or if the police bring up someone on charges in the United States, it's not the defendant doesn't have to agree to be there. They're there because that's the law. There's no such thing in the ICJ. The ICJ states only appear by their agreement. Now, the advisory opinions are a little bit different. The advisory opinions are not really legal cases at all. They're questions that are posed to the court by the General Assembly where the court gives a legal opinion. And the legal opinion has no binding authority. It's simply the opinion of some international lawyers that happen to also sit on this court. Right? Now, it's because there are no rules here. There's no trial. There's no collecting of evidence. There's no cross-examination of witnesses. There are no evidentiary standards. Right? The parties just come, say whatever they have to say. They make their arguments, and then the judges give you their a little bit legal and very much political opinions as a result of it.
So if we can put back up the questions again, it starts out saying what are the legal consequences of the ongoing violation by Israel of the right of Palestinian people to self-determination. That's built in there. And I think, Avi, it's important to point out that this resolution by the General Assembly, it was adopted by voted for by 87 nations. The majority either voted against or abstained or absent. It didn't even have a majority, but it's so skewed. What else do you see in here?
All right, so one of the things it tells the court is what it wants it doesn't ask the court here to determine that there's a state of Palestine that has sovereignty over the territory. It's giving the court a request to come up with a different theory. It wants the court to say, because the Palestinians have a right of self-determination and Jews do not have a right of self-determination in this territory, therefore Israel has no right to have any governing presence there. Now, that's not international law as it exists. That's a request that they create a special rule that's pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel, but the court will be very happy to oblige that.
But it's based on a right to self-determination to a future Palestinian state.
Right, well, a right of self-determination is something that exists in international law, and it's a right of peoples to self-governance. It does not entitle you per se to a state, right? So there are lots of places in the world where there's an acknowledged right of self-determination. For example, the Kurds have a right of self-determination, and they have territory in Turkey and Iraq, but there's no state of Kurdistan, and there isn't likely to be in the near future.
They got passed over.
Yeah, and you have a lot of different cases where there are nations with rights of self-determination, Quebecois, right, that do not have a right to establish a state because their self-governance does not strip other states of their sovereignty over the territory. And so in order to tell us what the Palestinian rights of self-determination are, you have to, A, figure out what are Israel's territorial rights, right? Maybe they supersede any Palestinian rights. And you also have to consider that Israel, the Jews, have self-determination rights that were recognized by the League of Nations all the way back 100 years ago. But the court will ignore both those things. That's not what the court is going to do. The court is going to presume that there are no Israeli rights whatsoever, that any Israeli rights that are asserted can be brushed aside, and they're going to jump right to the assumption that Palestinians have a right of self-determination that denies any Israeli presence, even though there is an agreement between the PLO and Israel about joint governance of Judea and Samaria.
They're going to ignore all of that.
They're going to ignore all of that.
But it's almost like asking the court to take, to assume or take judicial notice. It's a prolonged occupation, settlement, annexation that the court is already sort of bound by the question that's being asked.
Again, the court does not have to be bound by the question.
They don't even have to issue an opinion.
They do not even have to issue an opinion. The court has in the past creatively interpreted the question so as to dodge it. But the court is not going to do it in this case, right? The court has no political difficulties that will come to it from ruling against Israel. That's just expected, and that's what it's going to do. But the point of all this rhetoric in which it tells the court what the conclusions are before the court writes them is that it's signaling to the court what it wants. And the ICJ's role in advisory opinions is most often, not in every case, but most often simply to give the General Assembly what it wants. And so the General Assembly is telling the court here, it wants the court to rule that there's a Palestinian right of self-determination, which is absolute and overrides any Israeli rights. It wants it to rule that everything that Israel does, Jews living in Judea and Samaria, that is an unlawful settlement project, unlawful occupation that changes the demographic composition and character and status of the territory, which we're there to assume, and they will write, is Palestinian, meaning Arab Palestinian only with no Jewish character to any of the to the land or its history, and any Jews that live there are to be seen as alien occupiers who have no right to live in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, for example, or in Shiloh, or in Hebron.
The biblical heartland, 4,000-year-old connection.
Exactly.
Abraham was there.
We're to assume that there is no Jewish connection, no Jewish character to that land, and any Jew who lives there is an alien. And that will be assumed, it won't have to be proved, and so therefore they won't even discuss the fact of Jewish history in that land, right? Or not the biblical texts, and not the physical remains that you can find there to this day of the Jewish presence.
Mikvahs and synagogues. And
absolutely, right? You can stop by the roads. One of the unfortunate things in Judea and Samaria is because there is no proper archaeological governmental authority there. These sites are just sitting out there where you can stop your car and get out and take a look, and there's fabulous stuff if you have the knowledge to be able to understand what you're seeing. But it also means that the Palestinians have a systematic project of destroying everything that shows any Jewish remains.
Jewish presence,
right? Yeah. So if you drive north of of Jericho, for example, you stop on the side of the road. I saw once, I was driving, I saw this out of the corner of my eye, I saw some building, and so I went to look at what it is. And so it was very clearly Jewish construction, because you could see the mikvaot, the ritual baths. Right? So I looked it up, and it took me about 6 months worth of hunting to figure out what it was. And eventually I discovered that it was a city that was built by one of Herod's sons for Jewish workers who were building a palace in Jericho. And so it remained a Jewish city for some time afterwards, although eventually, of course, the Romans got rid of it. And just sitting there abandoned, last time I passed by it, there's Palestinian construction that had partially destroyed what was there. So, but that's something that's not going to be coming up in the ICJ's opinion, because it has a narrative that it's pushing, and the narrative has nothing to do with the facts. Yeah.
So we have two questions here. What are the legal consequences of Israel's prolonged occupation, altering the demographic composition character of Jerusalem? Got to remember, Jerusalem is also on the table here. And related discriminatory legislation and measures. Number two, policies and practice.
Right, so if you go to question B, yes. Right, I think the important part here is the last bit of it. What are the legal consequences that arise for all states in the United Nations from this status? Yeah. And what it's asking the court to do is, please tell us a list of sanctions that you want us to adopt against Israel. And absolutely the court will
where do we
abide by
go
that.
With lawfare against Israel next? Where do we go next?
Right. This is part of a long-term lawfare project of the PLO. Mahmoud Abbas wrote an editorial, an op-ed in the New York Times about 10 years ago. A little more than 10 years ago, in which he announced...
written by someone else,
right, but
Thomas Friedman or someone.
I don't know who. I would guess it was written within the Palestinian PLO's negotiations office. Sure. But it laid out was a fairly clear strategy of the Palestinians pushing a status of statehood in order to pursue systematic lawfare, that is to employ courts to come out with anti-Israel judgments, and for diplomatic and economic warfare against the Jewish state. And
while Hamas does the armed resistance, they do.
Well, the op-ed did not mention Hamas, but yes, it was a way of describing this is what the PLO wants to accomplish. Where you'll notice it does not want to accomplish peaceful coexistence. What it wants is statehood in order to continue a battle in new fronts. Yes. And that's
for the rest of the land.
For all of the land, for all of historic Palestine, as they would call it, or all of the historic land of Israel. Yeah, the historic land of Israel. And so they followed this strategy to a T, where the PLO is using every one of these institutions to carry on lawfare. And that's the point of something like this. Now, the ICJ, you have to remember, the ICJ doesn't really have any legal power. Even if it did, an advisory opinion would never have any power because it's simply the opinion of some. Yeah, it's non-binding. It's simply the opinion of some lawyers. Israel's not even a party to the case. They can't order Israel to do anything.
They don't have the power of the purse or the sword.
They have, even less than that, they don't even have the ability to persuade, because I think that the institution has lost so much of its credibility
Who reads
that
their opinions, yes.
yeah, that it cannot convince. But that's not the point of this. The idea of opinions like this from the ICJ are to give something that sounds like it's giving an official stamp of approval on anti-Israel measures, and it's all being done within a closed circle. You have institutions that create narrative, anti-Israel narrative. They're cut off from the facts. They create their own facts.
And they're funded by Western democratic countries.
Absolutely,
all the funding we give to these NGOs.
And even worse, in some cases, they are Western NGOs. That are doing this, and they're quite conscious of the fact that they're creating a false narrative. The purpose of their reports is not to tell what is happening; it's to create a narrative that people can use instead of the facts. It's what was called in the U.S. alternative facts, where they're not facts at all, right? It's an alternative story that's not based on facts. And then the idea of the ICJ opinions and these other legal sounding rulings is to turn that narrative into a program of action that you can carry through bureaucracies and other institutions that are inclined to be
Number
anti-Israel.
one is an arms embargo.
So you already have efforts to have an arms embargo in numerous places in Europe. In Britain,
the Netherlands can't give spare parts, their U.S. spare parts for the new F-35 planes. The U.K., there's not only legal battles over the U.K. there's pro-Palestinian elements that go and destroy the warehouses.
Absolutely, these are all linked. You have, right? It's not the idea of the actions in the courts is not to resolve anything by law. It's primarily to provide tools for battles that are taking place elsewhere, and those battles are somewhat in the bureaucracy, but they're also on the streets, and you're seeing that more and more, and unfortunately this has spilled over to places where I'm shocked to see it happening. In the streets of major cities in the United States, you have street battles against Jewish people that are justified by alleged legal wrongdoing of Israel, and the ICJ is going to play an important part of this.
It's to only fuel it, this ruling that comes out.
Absolutely.
But they're basically a minority of the members of the UN General Assembly ask for a non-binding advisory opinion. They put question marks at the end. They're questions, but they just want the court to put a period at the end, leading them down this road.
They want the court to say, yes, you're right, yes, you're right, yes, you're right. And that's exactly what the court is going to say.
Okay. But it's non-binding if these nations that are supporting this Palestinian lawfare effort, if they want to really enforce this, they then have to go to the UN Security Council, correct? Where the U.S. has its veto ready to help protect Israel from things that are
so
going
the
too
UN
far.
The UN has very limited powers, but this has nothing per se to do with the ICJ. The UN has limited powers to do anything. It has the power to talk. One of the few institutions within the UN system that has some power is the Security Council. And the Security Council can adopt binding sanctions that require states to not act in certain economic ways towards certain states. That said, even binding sanctions, while they may be binding under international law, they're not self-enforcing. And
you have to get a coalition of countries that are willing to go enforce it and get a UN Security Council
absolutely. And so you can see the difficulties where on paper there are all sorts of sanctions that ought to be there against Iran, for example. They're simply ignored because they're inconvenient. So I don't think it makes sense to try to tie the ICJ to what will happen in the Security Council. Security Council has its own process. It's not absolutely powerful. It's more powerful than the ICJ. There is, as you said, a U.S. veto, which may or may not be exercised. It's it's a little bit the politics of the way the Biden administration has treated the Security Council in Israel has been a little bit funny. Let's put it that way. But that doesn't require lean on anything that the ICJ does. The Security Council has its own agenda. Now, I can tell you that the Palestinians will be going to the Security Council repeatedly for various measures against Israel, including sanctions. But they already have been, and they will do so again. And they don't
just to embarrass the U.S. if they have to using its veto over and over.
I think that's part of it, and it's partly that they're not worried about alienating the United States. The U.S. governments over the years, both Republicans and Democrats, have asked the Palestinians to tone it down in the Security Council and in the ICJ, and in various institutions, and the Palestinians have ignored them. They understanding there are no consequences for the Palestinians disobeying or making trouble. It gets to the extent that in the ICJ, the Palestinians sued the United States, right? Which is beyond belief, and there were no consequences.
Yeah, the Palestinian Authority has made this choice, telling the Palestinian people, we're going to go get you state. The Palestinian Authority, at least the polls, that this whole lawfare campaign, they're not satisfied that it's really brought them anything so far.
I don't think that you should look at that as an either-or choice. Yeah. There's the Palestinians.
I think it's a division of labor between the two, that it's agreed.
It's not even that. It's you have competing organizations that both engage in terrorism. The PLO still engages in terrorism. Yes. It still funds terrorism. Fatah still employs terrorists. It still gives them
pay for slay.
Absolutely. So it does also, and it also has this lawfare campaign that it runs. Now, Hamas, its main efforts are in the terrorism arena, but it also engages in lawfare, and you can see that today at the ICJ, where South Africa is cooperating with Hamas in bringing a suit against Israel for
Iran primarily, but Hamas,
with the claim of genocide. And Hamas is happy to talk about this. Hamas representatives are happy to talk about this with the media.
And run on the death count.
They do lots of work with the media, and this is one of the things. You're quite right that they do other things with the media involving war propaganda. But the thing to remember is that Hamas and Fatah are both engaging in lawfare and engaging in terrorism, and Hamas likes to pitch itself as focused primarily on terrorism, and the PLO likes to pitch itself as primarily interested in this diplomatic and economic and lawfare against Israel. But they're both doing both, right? There's an agreed upon Palestinian strategy of how to tackle the Israel problem being that the state exists at all. And the only question is how much relative weight to give to each one of these components of the common strategy.
Okay, I think you were really starting to get into this territory of even the ruling. You expect it to be pretty bad against Israel.
Yes. That
it'll fuel even more lawfare, sanctions and all. But if the UN Security Council does do something in response to this, it's the Article 6 versus Article 7. Can you explain a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So
one's binding, one's non-binding.
So the powers of the different UN bodies are laid out in the UN Charter, and most UN bodies, most of the time, have only one formal legal authority, and that's the authority to talk and to advise, right? Which means nothing, right? And the Security Council, it has the authority to do that as well, and that's outlined in Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, that the Security Council has the right to talk and to advise. But in addition, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter says that the Security Council has the right to undertake binding action including going to war. Right?
This was the Gulf War when the Security Council said Iraq's occupation of Kuwait, we can form a coalition under Article 7 to get them
right,
out,
under
and
Chapter
that was
7.
approved. Yeah.
Under Chapter 7, that's
Approved
right.
by the Security Council, a war against Iraq.
And the powers of the Security Council in Chapter 7, they're not to reach legal conclusions. They're not. It's not a legal body. It's an executive body.
Mm-hmm.
But it's an executive body that has a right to impose sanctions, and has a right to go to war, and has a right to impose a blockade, and has a right to do all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the rules in Chapter 7 for these kinds of measures is, first of all, of the 15 members of the Security Council, you have to have a statutory majority. You have to have nine states voting in favor. And you must not have a negative vote of any of the 5 permanent members: the United States, Russia, Britain, France, and China. Mm-hmm. And so there's these 5 vetoes out there in addition to having to get 9. It's hard to win the approval in the Security Council. And the Security Council, because it has powers under Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, that is, it has the power to talk and the power to do, it has to tell us whether it's doing or just talking. Mm-hmm. And so in any resolution that they adopt, it's either Chapter 6 or Chapter 7. You have to look at the resolution and see what they've done.
And all the resolutions, 242, 338, all the resolutions concerning Israel have all been under Chapter 6, which are advisory. They're suggestions. Correct. Here's a path to resolve your differences between Israel
Correct.
and the Palestinians.
And that's not by accident. It's very, very rare for the Security Council to employ Chapter 7, because all of a sudden it's it's not just talk.
Someone's got to do something.
Right. It's real. And so there have been cases where unfriendly administrations have allowed Chapter 6 resolutions against Israel. Happened under Carter's years, under Obama, for example.
Last act in the as they were leaving.
Right, a parting shot across the bow
against Netanyahu.
Right. Well, it was against Israel.
Yes.
So, and it may be that we'll see the same thing from the Biden administration. It's difficult to say about the politics, but it's not the same politics for Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. So while there may be something, and it's not necessarily related to the ICJ, there may be resolutions against Israel under Chapter 6 that the United States will not veto.
Yes.
But it would be quite remarkable for there to be a Chapter 7. Yeah.
That's when you know it's very serious, that some sort of forced imposed action is coming. Okay, that's all. This is all very interesting and fascinating, Avi, and I think we already have a sense of where you think the ruling is going to come out on Friday, to sort of, even though it was a minority, it's trying to get all the nations. You got to start heading in this direction of sanctioning Israel, especially arms embargoes and things like that. But let's just ask about the genocide case. You mentioned it, that South Africa petitioned the court to declare Israel in violation of the 1949 treaty for the prevention and punishment of genocide. Right. And where do you see that now? They've issued 2 rulings, but it wasn't quite so hard on Israel.
Well, let's understand the whole purpose of this case. Now, the Genocide Convention is a convention that's convenient for states to use, because it says that any disputes between states about interpretation of the convention, the ICJ automatically has jurisdiction. And in general, the ICJ doesn't have jurisdiction between states. So this is a big deal. Mm-hmm. Right? So if you want to get a case to the court, then you should make up a claim about genocide. And the way the court interprets it, like everything else, it interprets it to give itself maximum jurisdiction. So it says, if 2 states that have nothing to do with anything have a dispute about maybe a theoretical possible violation of the Genocide Convention some other place that isn't real, that's good enough to give the court jurisdiction.
It was flimsy.
Right. So in this case, the South Africans came up with a preposterous argument not that Hamas is committing genocide, which it is, committing genocidal acts against the Jewish people, but no, it's Israel in its defensive actions against Hamas. It's committing the genocide. Now, the idea of South Africa here is not to win. The idea of South Africa is to get two things out of this. First of all, it's trying to change the narrative. And a lot of, as I said, a lot of what's done in the ICJ is simply to bolster and to give legal sounding backing to a narrative, an alternative narrative, and an alternative narrative in which the Jews are evil. And people who fight the Jews are necessarily good and innocent, even if they're Hamas terrorist barbarians. They're the good and the innocent, and the Jews are the evil. And so part of what they're doing there is promoting it, and in that they've already won, right? Everybody knows about this. Nobody's talking about Hamas acts of genocide. Everybody's asking the question, has Israel done something wrong? Has Israel committed genocide? Which is a preposterous claim, but nonetheless, it's, they succeeded in getting it out there and treat it as if it's serious. Now, the other thing that they were trying to do, the ICJ has rules in these cases where before you even get to the merits, before they rule on anything, they're allowed to issue preliminary measures. And preliminary measures don't require anything whatsoever. The standard that the court uses is if it's plausible that there are rights at stake, then it can issue preliminary orders. And so the court met when South Africa presented its petition. They asked, is it plausible that the Palestinians have a right not to be subject to genocide? Now, of course it's plausible, right? Of course, everyone has a right not to be exposed to genocide. The Palestinians have such a right. The Israelis have such a right. The British have such a right. Everyone has such a right. But once they decided that, then they've authorized their own jurisdiction. Now you can throw everything out and they can do whatever they want. And the South Africans asked for is a list of a whole variety of things that would cripple Israel's war against Hamas. And the ICJ so far has given the South Africans roughly 1 out of every 3 of their requests, right? And I think that that's the South African strategy here. They're going to keep doing this. They're going to keep asking for more preliminary measures. The ICJ is going to continue giving some. And I will say that Israel has made a terrible mistake that has tried to comply with the measures that have been ordered so far, because eventually we're going to get to something where the ICJ orders something that Israel just can't comply with. And it's better to call this farce for what it is now before we get to that. But there's a game of simply going along with the preliminary measures. Who knows when the eventual opinion will be? And even for the ICJ, it'll be very difficult to argue with a straight face that Israel is committing genocide. So,
even then, whatever they rule, the only way to enforce it again is the Security Council.
Right. There won't be anything enforceable about it.
But the whole propaganda war, Israel takes another hit.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay, and the International Criminal Court, which is separate from the UN system but cooperates with it. It's also in The Hague, and they have an official probe against Israel for possible war crimes against the Palestinians. And since this war started last October 7, the new chief prosecutor has now sought arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu, for Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and for 3 Hamas leaders, one of whom was probably just taken out by the IDF.
Maybe late leader.
Of less than blessed memory.
Exactly so.
And where is this going? Right.
So this is now getting on almost its 10th year. This action against Israel. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, opened its preliminary investigation on what it calls the situation in Palestine in 2015, in January. And we're now more than halfway through 2014. They upped it from a preliminary investigation to a full-scale investigation in 2021, when the new prosecutor came to town, Karim Khan. And it's been fairly clear from the beginning that the ICC doesn't really have jurisdiction here, because the ICC's jurisdiction is limited to cases where the state has accepted the jurisdiction.
They've signed on to the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court.
Right. That's the way you accept it, by signing on to the statute, or there are a couple of other ways. Anyway, the PLO did all these things, but the PLO is not a state. And so,
for their purposes, it was deemed a state.
Right. So one of the things that the ICC already did 3 years ago is a pretrial chamber of the ICC ruled on the prosecutor's claim that there's a state of Palestine. The prosecutor claimed that there's a state of Palestine back in 2015. She put it before the then prosecutor, Fatah Bensouda, put it before the ICC pretrial chamber in 2021. The court ruled that Palestine is enough of a state to give us jurisdiction. And since then, it's been working, the ICC prosecutorial staff have been working overtime on coming up with charges against Israelis. Now, we don't have a full accounting of this. Preliminary investigations, the prosecutor has to report every year what she's done. For full-scale investigations, they don't have to report at all. So from 2015 to 2020, we got reports from the ICC prosecutor every year what alleged horrible things Israel had done that she was looking into. She was never looking into any Palestinian wrongdoing. And then the reports ended because it was moved to a full investigation. But Karim Khan has clearly followed the same course, and he came up with some preposterous claims against Israeli leaders, such as that there's a secret Israeli conspiratorial plan to starve all the Palestinian people, and that even though there's this entire legal procedure by which Israel targets and carries out strikes against military targets, really behind this there's a secret conspiracy to target Palestinian civilians. And this is not one that I think is supposed to hold up in court. It's designed to also to shape narrative and to harass Israelis. I'm fairly sure that no Israeli leader will ever be foolish enough to allow themselves to go into custody into a courtroom in The Hague. And so it creates this narrative, and part of the creating this narrative is the fig leaf of even-handedness, where you issue some arrest warrants that's very clear are never going to go anywhere either. The ones against Hania, the richly deserved ones, I have to say, against Hania and Def and Yahya Sinwar, where I have to say those warrants are quite light. Of the numerous crimes that they've committed, it picks out just a few, and it's clearly just as the fig leaf for the main action, which is against Israel.
I want to go down with our last sort of avenue of question, a different route here. That Karim Khan, this UK chief prosecutor now at the International Criminal Court, he belongs to some Muslim sect that doesn't accept the existence of Israel, and that should disqualify him. And in this case we're talking about, the advisory opinion that will come out on Friday, the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, was allowed to weigh in on this. And we went to The Hague, we were there, we saw you there, where we said, well, Christians who support Israel should be able to weigh in. It's not fair that the Muslim world, the Islamic world, can weigh in so heavily with an official submittal. We want to express our opinion concerning our support for the 4,000-year-old Jewish claim in connection to Israel. And I mean, is there something unfair that the Muslim world has this certain advantage to the OIC? You've got this judge, and no one calls it into question, but this judge, Subatende, who's a Christian who loves Israel, her credentials are actually starting to be called into question. She's biased because she's a Christian Zionist. There seems to be something very unfair built into the system to the Muslim world's advantage.
So a lot of this is the politics that you see in the UN. So in the UN, there are, I believe, 56 states that are members of the organization, the Islamic Cooperation. And because of the regional grouping system, it means that they effectively control two regional groups. That is, 40% of the General Assembly in the UN. And given the way the regional groups with Christian majorities go, they're not putting up a fight. In fact, they for the most part, go along with it. Mm-hmm. And so the Western European states and the Latin American states, for the most part, and you have to be cautious here, because there are some states that in different times have expressed different values. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, they've simply gone along with the anti-Israel agenda of the Islamic states. And so it's built into the system, it's built into the appointments, it's built into the structure. You have the same kind of politics in the ICC and the Assembly of State Parties. And so again, it's perfectly clear what's going to happen. And I think for that reason, it's a little bit of a mistake to focus too much on who gets to speak, mm-hmm. right? Because let's say that Christian organizations got the opportunity to speak before the ICJ on the same footing mm-hmm. as Islamic institutions. Would the outcome be any different? Mm-hmm. No, because the politics of appointing judges is the same, and the politics of the institution is the same. And so you would say your bit, and then they would ignore you and come out with the same anti-Israel ruling.
Mm. Yeah, I think that some diplomats and other government leaders would have to rethink, is it fair for these Muslims to have their specific religious view represented there and not Christians, and maybe they'd say that.
I think that it's a voice. Yours is a voice that must be heard.
Yeah, and we did that.
But it's not in the forum of the ICJ. Yeah. I think you have to speak to the many governments of Christian countries to weigh in.
We signed a decree delivered to the court, the registrar of the court, to be distributed to the 15 justices, saying we believe the Jews have this ancient historic right to the whole land.
Well, God bless you. Amen. Thank you.
Okay, that's our time for now. This whole decision by the International Court of Justice and advisory opinion, as we've held this discussion, I think it's another step along the way where the international community is in a process of trying to divide the land of Israel, which may bring them, you wear a kippah, you're an observant, believing Jew, that may trigger the Joel 3 judgment about dividing the land. But we thank you for your time. Avi Bell, a law professor here in Israel and at the University of San Diego. Thank you, Avi.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure as always.
Okay. That's our time for this week's edition of the ICEJ webinar series. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next Thursday, 3 p.m. Israel time. And also stay tuned at the top of the hour. You can go to the daily global prayer gathering of the Christian Embassy and join with Christians from all over the world to pray for Israel and this region and the whole world as Israel continues its march towards victory in this war with Hamas in Gaza. Thank you and shalom from Jerusalem.
Thank you for joining us for this informative webinar. Be sure to subscribe to our social media channels or visit our website at icej.org for upcoming webinars and more ICEJ exclusive content.
In just a few months, this coming October, Israel will be marking 1 year since the great tragedy of October 7 last year. And we want to invite you to join us here in Jerusalem at that time to help encourage and comfort the people of Israel. The Christian Embassy will be hosting our annual Feast of Tabernacles celebration from the 16th through the 23rd of October. We will be gathering here in Jerusalem with Christians from around the world for this very timely prophetic feast. We will visit some of the worst hit areas on October 7 so you can witness firsthand what happened here in Israel. You will also meet Israelis who are starting to rebuild their lives and can encourage them on their road to recovery. We will also have a desert celebration in the lovely setting of Kfar Navdim and all our usual feast events here in Jerusalem, such as the colorful Roll Call of the Nations and a special communion service at the Garden Tomb. But we're also going to gather here in Sacre Park and march through the streets of Jerusalem to express our love and support directly to the Jewish people. You want to be here. 1 year into this difficult conflict, there's no better time to come show your solidarity with Israel. Our feast registration is open. Visit feast.icej.org to learn more about how you can take part in this very special Feast of Tabernacles 2024.